mass communication. I want to acknowledge and to thank our co-sponsor today, the Minnesota Public Relations Society of America. I'm joined here by several panelists. I'll start with those affiliated by the school. First, I want to introduce Amy O'Connor. Amy is an associate professor of strategic communication who's an expert on corporate social responsibility and public relations. Amy, if you want to take yourself off mute and say hello. Oops.
Thank you for that. I'm glad to be here. I welcome all the panelists.
Great. And Stacey Kanihan, our Associate Professor of Strategic Communication. She's also our Academic Director for our Professional Master's Program in Strategic Communication. Stacey? And I'll just introduce everyone. Hopefully we're having some issues with the mute. I'll ask our technical team to make sure that everyone on the panel can be unmuted themselves. And we also have Marsha Pitts-Phillips, President and Founder of MRPP and Associates, a member of the Twin Cities Black Journalists. She's their Diversity and Inclusion Officer and member of, board member of the Minnesota PRSA. Marsha has also been a Hubbard School Diversity Fellow and lecturer for us in the school. We also have Stan Alleyne, our Chief Communications Officer from Vital Aware Services. He was also formerly Chief Communications Officer from Minneapolis Public Schools and a senior consultant at Tunheim Consulting Firm here in Minneapolis. Tom Jollie is past president of PRSA. He's Senior Vice President of Padilla. He also works on corporate, the corporate advisory group at Padilla. He's a PRSA fellow. Some of his crisis communication experience includes food and product recalls, MSP Airport, and the Prince Estate. We also have Alberto Monserrate, a co-founder and CEO of NewPublica. For those who might be less familiar, attending from outside of Minneapolis, Padilla, NewPublica, and Tunheim are locally grown public relations and strategic communications firm, and we were thrilled to have this very experienced panel of experts here. I also want to begin by acknowledging the pain and the grief here in our Minneapolis-St. Paul community. We recognize that George Floyd will be buried in Houston on Tuesday, and many of our members of the community are grieving deeply. Many of the professional journalists in our community organizers, protesters, others continues to work tirelessly to address issues of racism in our community. And as a school, we thought what we could do during this time was to work together to educate the public on the roles and responsibilities of journalists and communication professionals. So recognizing this, we are able to host the panel today. And this event is the second in a series of town hall panels. This morning, we posted others to our website on the roles and responsibilities of journalists. Today is the beginning of the conversation, but we do expect that many more questions will remain unanswered. Before we begin, I need to share a little bit regarding logistics this afternoon, I suppose. First, this is a webinar that is being recorded. We plan to upload this recording to our website and social media next week so that you may share it with others who were not able to attend this morning. Second, our panelists will talk for about 45 minutes before answering questions. They'll first answer some questions that I have prepared for them, but you also might ask questions by just typing them into the Q&A box. If you go down and look by the participant button on your screen, you'll note a Q&A box. Please go ahead and type in your questions. I will select as many questions as we can to be answered live. Others, I know that other faculty in the school and some of the professionals, if there are questions that remain, you may feel free to follow up with them afterwards. Our email addresses are available on the school's website. You'll note that there's no chat function available today. That's because we really wanted to focus on the questions that you have for panelists. We will answer as many questions as we can live. But first, I want to start with a couple questions that I had for this very distinguished group. First, I wanted to ask everyone to kind of take turns answering this. I wanted to think about the contours of the communication environment that's here right now. particularly the contours and environment after a police-involved homicide or murder, as the charges are in this case. What are some of the particular challenges to crisis communication and public relations? Tom, do you think you want to begin?
Sure, I'll take a go at it. So first of all, I think when we think about generating news and news conferences or press conferences are so vital to our democratic society because it, in this circumstance, it allows our leaders to be held accountable, especially when they're open to having, making statements and answering questions, and that creates a level of accountability. And if there's one word that I've heard through this crisis that we're experiencing now, and maybe even COVID before, is that people are calling others to be accountable on lots of different levels. But I have personally appreciated Governor Walz's press conferences. I think they've allowed him to take some leadership in a time when people are looking for some leadership or maybe concerned about lack of leadership. I think Governor Walz has done a great job of framing issues, and that's really important. I think in the current context, there are many issues that I think people are grappling with. So I've appreciated that some of those have come forward. I think at the same time, there have been some statements, and I think this was one of your questions, where maybe people had to walk back on their answers and had some misinformation. And at times when that happens and people admit their mistake or at least acknowledge it and give us the source of the misinformation, I have found that very appreciative, and I think the media has as well. And so I think that it's really important for that context. I think another aspect of the news conferences that has been important across the board is that it allows our leaders to share their understanding, share their willingness to listen, to share their empathy towards the situation. And I think deep down, when I look at the landscape here, people who are being successful in communicating are feeling the pain and showing the empathy. So I think that's a good thing. Another word that I've heard a lot, that we all have probably heard a lot, is the concept of transparency. And I think people are making strides and big efforts to be more transparent than ever before. And I think the news conference forum has borne that out to some degree. So that's my opening thoughts on your question.
I'm very interested in getting some thoughts from others. Marsha, you've worked as both a journalist and public relations professional. What are some of the challenges to this crisis and public relations moment? And what do you think of these press conferences as well?
Press conferences, first of all, as we know, when it comes to them, we must talk from the viewpoint of the public. Tom touched on some of the really key points in terms of being transparent. First of all, I just want to say good afternoon to everyone who's out there, and thank you, Elisia and the Hubbard School, for pulling this together. And one little correction, I'm Diversity and Inclusion Officer for Minnesota PRSA, and I'm also a member of Twin Cities Black Journalists and the National Association of Black Journalists Media Related Task Force. But back to your question, there are really complex matters that have to be addressed. And when it comes to a situation like what we saw unfold, and that we have seen unfold repeatedly over these last several years, And when I say repeatedly, over the last several years, I'm referring to recorded, where we have video as it pertains to police-related homicides that involves a citizen of the public, and coming forward and addressing those. And being in a situation of not having to walk back, that transparency, being timely, taking accountability for actions, and of course, prior to coming forward, having to ensure that you properly, the spokesperson for the organization properly vets the information that they're putting forward. But if nothing else, the public, once again, talking from the viewpoint of the public, they're looking for truth, they're looking for ethics, the ethical component for the organization, and they're looking for that transparency. And if I might also add, vulnerability, because that's something else that I've seen over these last over this last week and a half or so, has been the vulnerability of spokespersons of our leadership, whether it's the governor, the police chief, whether it's been the mayor, commissioners, city council members, community leaders, but particularly those from which the public is seeking answers from, is that willingness to add that layer of vulnerability. And I think that that then helps to build the trust level from the public.
Thanks, Marsha. Others?
I think I would just sort of pick up with one thing that Marsha said about the idea of this unfolding and how that creates sort of a communication challenge for people in an environment that's shifting. And so focusing on the need for accuracy, and when you don't have the information, to acknowledge that and work with the press about when you think you will have that information, because that helps enhance your credibility. And I think the other challenge in this particular situation is the multiple agencies that are all coming together to speak on a single situation, and oftentimes they have different goals and needs. And so trying to balance as your organization, communicating with publics and recognizing where they're at and how their expectations for your organization may have changed because of this situation, and demonstrating that empathy as it unfolds, because you will have so many messages that will go out over the period of time with this, because this will be years, as A.D. Ellenson said, that you're going to be communicating about this.
Alberto?
Yeah, I just wanted to observe to how, the timeliness and also the need of understanding of intended audiences. I have seen a lot of progress with the different offices that we're communicating with, having people of color giving advice on communications that are going out, and also giving advice on our leaders on how they communicate and how they will be perceived. One of the complications here, for example, I'm a night owl, and I did get a press release at 12:41 a.m. Talking about medical conditions, that kind of the communication, a lot of us, the initial communication that came from the police. At about 1:19 a.m., I actually saw the video for the first time, as several members of the community that I know were posting the actual video. So the actual immediate disconnect between the press release and the communication coming out and what everybody was seeing, I think at the very, very initial, and then literally by 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock a.m., tens of thousands of people had seen the video. And how that was handled at the beginning did add to the anger and the pain a lot of people, and the distrust of the information that was coming out. So I think that's something that is also something that's really complicated things, and how we have to have full teams of people that are aware of what is happening out there. At 3 a.m., the video, there was another communication talking about how the FBI was investigating the case, although there was no clarification from the press release before. So just other things to consider.
Stan?
A lot of good things said here. I'm going to take a little different perspective. We have all PR communications people on. And so I feel like in this in instances like this, you get really a chance to see who has leadership ability and who's going to really be confident enough to control a message in a timely, and speed is of the essence. And it's not the time to have a debate with the boss. You guys need to work through the protocols before that, and everybody can tell if it hasn't been. So along with Alberto, he was talking about the speed and the timeliness. I agree. But I also think you can tell when you are controlling the voice of the leadership. And when you're in a crisis, we have to do that. And especially when information keeps coming and keep coming after us, somebody has to be the one, okay, we're going to shut it off right here. This is all we're going to give here. And then maybe in the next 2 hours, we're going to give more, or we're going to give more. But that's something that needs to be decided long before the crisis happens. And then vetting the information. Like, you need to have a system in place where yeah, this is a great statement, but now let's get enough people on this statement so we can vet it and to see if it's appropriate at the time. And then the last thing is making sure that the communication resonates to critical audiences and not just like a politician or a different group, but you really need to see, okay, we're going to send something out there. What is this community how are they going to respond to this? How are they going to react to this? And really, it's a lot. And I was at Minneapolis Public Schools for years, and it was crisis after crisis. And so I'm very, I feel for the people in the middle of it, but you do get a chance to see who's a leader and who has the ability to control things in that moment.
Stan, those are excellent points. And I see that Marsha wants to jump in too. So I'm just going to follow up on the comment related to vetting, because in recent days, we've learned that some of the comments, of course, that have been made in press conferences have been inaccurate. For example, Mayor Carter, who indicated that everyone arrested last night in St. Paul was from out of state. Later, he walked back to indicate that he did come forward and say that, quote, he was wrong about this information, that he received inaccurate information from a police briefing. Mayor Frey and the governor echoed similar comments, saying that the majority of arrests that were made had been from out of state. And this information was repeated by many others before it was corrected by journalists who looked, of course, at arrest records and said, is this true? When you heard and saw this, go back to Marsha, because I know she wanted to get in. What are your thoughts as a communication professional?
If I can just go back just a moment to build upon what Stan said, and I will address your comment, Elisia, your question, Elisia, and that is part of what we saw happening too in the immediate aftermath of Mr. Floyd's, with the death of Mr. Floyd, is that in the African American communities, we know we've been dealing with the pandemic of COVID-19. And we have seen and heard it said that African Americans in particular feel as though there's a double pandemic that's going on. So there's the pandemic of COVID-19, in which you have African Americans who are more likely to, according to statistics, more likely to contract it and more likely to die from it. And then you have the pandemic, the underlying pandemic of what we perceive as racism in African American communities. And so layer that into everything else that was going on at the time of Mr. Floyd's death. That's another added pressure that I believe that PR professional spokespersons that we're dealing with and must be addressed. In terms of the vetting of the information about outside agitators coming into the community, prior to that being reported, prior to us hearing the statement from the governor, the mayors, and police chiefs, and why that story was even told, I was hearing that information. I was getting information from who I believe to be credible sources. And it was important to have that information looked at and researched and the story told. And even though the numbers, from what I understand, appear to be low of the number of people who have been arrested, the story is still out there. And there may need to be some further digging on this. I don't know what the ultimate outcome is going to be, but in speaking to the publics and understanding who our audiences are, that audience, and talking from the viewpoint of, and telling a story and communicating from the viewpoint of the public, it still, I think, bears further research and to help spell that, because discontent, the feelings of the lack of transparency, the breakdown of trust will continue unless there's something more to, unless further digging is done.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And just building on that, and something that you mentioned about, and that Alberto mentioned about the initial announcement from the police department and then the release of the video in conflict with each other. A big watch out that I think is really important that's related to confirming the information you have is just, as PR people, we're usually working for those leaders and we get some direction from them, correct? And to some degree, they might be telling us, this is what I want to say, this is what I want to do. But it's up to us to, I think, see the big picture and push back when we need to. And a lot of times in crisis situations, and I believe this may have happened with the police department, is, you know, they rush to judgment maybe, or maybe they want to position something some way. You know, clearly in this case, the statement was very vague and probably trying to communicate something that wasn't true. But I think at the time, it probably wasn't appropriate to make that judgment. And oftentimes it's okay to say, we don't know. Here are the facts. We're still investigating, and we'll give you an update in an hour. And I think when I'm working with clients, you know, we really try and help them not overreach on anything, because they're going to be in that situation then where they've stated something and they don't have the facts after all, or they got them wrong, or they didn't have time to bulletproof them. And as I think, Stan, you said, you know, things are just happening so quickly that getting accurate information is so important. And, you know, here's something else I observed. I think that's, just throw it here in the mix since we're kind of covering all the bases, is I am just amazed at where people get their news, right? There's a large contingent of our society that is not reading newspapers. They aren't watching the TV news. They are getting their news on Facebook. They're getting their news on Twitter, and they're getting it in like 20 words. And how can you explain anything in that? So I think one of the big challenges in managing a crisis is really understanding what's happening in those social channels. And I think in this case, what I experienced a little bit is, you know, if you aren't in those communities or regularly on those channels, you don't know where it's exactly happening, and you have to go look for it. And it's work. And, you know, you have to have a team of people who are intuitive enough to know in this crisis, who's really driving the conversation and how can I find out what they're saying so I can learn what other people are learning at the same time. And that is going to help you be smarter in what you say, and it's going to help you understand the evolving situation better. And I think that's just an emerging challenge that we all have as communicators, to get that big picture perspective as the crisis is happening.
I was going to agree with you, Tom, that we definitely need to do a good job of monitoring social media. And going back to Alicia's initial question of our thoughts as communication professionals when the mayors and the governor were talking about most arrests were from out of state. And I agree that as communications professionals who are advising that team of leaders, perhaps they should have said, hey, let's take some more time and let's run down those facts. It is important to know that there were several people from out of state who were joining in, but I think the governor's emotion that he had worked for and slightly against him in this case. I think, Tom, you mentioned that the governor did appear as quite credible and trustworthy in those news conferences, but at the same time, he so badly wanted, I think, to think that so much of the agitation was due to the out-of-state citizens. And I think that was wishful thinking. And at the same time, that's causing our leaders, our state leaders, our city leaders to look at the problems, not just the protests, but what are the issues underlying those protests? The racism, the failure of police departments to respond in a way that protects citizens. And so we saw a little bit of wishful thinking going on. And at the same time, we now see government leaders who not only had to walk that back and apologize, but need to address some of those underlying issues and not just the immediate crisis at hand.
Can I go next? I would love to take a little angle. My initial thought was, I was so frustrated and annoyed. I've lived here for 11 years now, and I moved from North Carolina and New York, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard not Minnesotans or we're Minnesotans. And I know that there's pride in Minnesota, but what I've learned coming from different places, every state has the same kind of mindset. And so I don't think it really mattered at that moment if it was out of state or in state, because there were fires, there were people being injured and all kinds of things. So I don't know why that was relevant. And I feel like the quality of people that were delivering the message, I mean, they knew better. And so when one person did it, I feel like, and this is a lesson, be strong enough to stand up and maybe not keep it going. In the room in preparation, we also know in crisis communication, we're going to give them talking points. We're going to give them talking points. There's ongoing investigation. Everything is breaking right now. And for those veterans, for those experienced communications folks, they just stick to the talking points. Stick to the talking points, and the media is expecting you to. And if you just you're giving them extra, and they're not even thinking they're going to get that. And so, I mean, I know hindsight, I'm real smart now, but I just feel like it went away from the principles of what we teach every day. And I also think that that's where the Minnesotans are different than everybody else. That mindset really kind of came back and bit them.
Can I add something to that, Elisia? I think as comms professionals, we know that denial in a crisis situation is the most dangerous strategy you can use. And so when I was listening to those press conferences, one of the things that struck me was that it was almost sort of what Stan was saying, this denial that we have these problems in Minnesota. And that's a dangerous place to be. And I think that sort of denying that to some extent was an unintentional dismissive of the murder of Mr. Floyd. And I think that really the job of the comms people is to sort of coach people and against those decisions, even though it's hard, to be that voice in the room that says, we have to be sure that this is honest and true and accurate. And even though we don't want to maybe admit those things about ourselves or our organization, in this case, the state of Minnesota, we need to go where some of the data takes us. To Marsha's point at the very beginning, this is not the first police issue with citizens. And so I just wanted to kind of echo those 2 points.
I just wanted to add, just full disclosure, I do work for do some work for the city of St. Paul and the mayor on communicating some of their initiatives. I was not involved with any of the communications around what's been happening, but I would say that he does have a very competent communications team, a very detail-oriented communications team. I suspect that part of what happened here, and I think it could have been done a little bit different when they were getting information out about out-of-state people, is I do believe that they wanted to put, and I'm speculating, a narrative out there because they knew what was coming with National Guard and curfews to get more buy-in from especially a lot of people who were out in the street. And I think it was accurate that there were a number of people that were involved, that were getting into protests. A lot of them happened to be from Minnesota, but that maybe had a different agenda than the pain and the anger that people felt after the murder. And they were bringing other agendas and bringing violence to do that. And I think that could have been communicated. We're seeing reports that some of this might be going on. Be careful and put that without having to say that everybody was from out of town. So I think that was probably a very complicated situation where, we want to put a narrative out there. But, and again, as Stan was saying before, preparation for this type of event, you can never fully prepare, but the more prepared you are ahead of time, the easier it is to be able to do this in the right way.
If I can jump in and build upon what Alberto and Stan were saying, both in terms of preparation and in terms of us providing talking points as well. I think that when I look back at that press conference, I believe it was just about a week ago, just under a week ago, there was a lot in that particular press conference. There were a number of issues that were covered. It was very complex. And as we all know, that the purpose of the press conference is to be able to speak to very complex information to the public. We have to provide, really delve in to background information. So they were covering the issues of the looting and the rioting that had occurred over a 2-night period. They were dealing with the rumors. And I think we all agree that there was another way that could have been addressed. But there is also the very real challenge that we are talking about, perhaps the highest profile, or one of the highest profiles globally, that occurred with what authorities are now calling the murder of Mr. Floyd. Not Marsha's words, but authorities are referring to. And the comms folks who are involved in terms of crafting the messages and providing counsel, when we look at the other competing narrative that's being put out by large news organizations such as CNN, that who's doing the rioting, who's doing the looting, this is who we see, we're not seeing Black people. And they were trying to counter that narrative of the, Chris Cuomo's words, the angry Black mob. Because as an African-American woman, often when it comes to these situations, it's angry Black people. And so I think that there were just so many competing, complex, layered messages that the communications folks had to probably dig deep into their well of knowledge and expertise in terms of providing our leadership, and I'm talking state right down to everyone, to bring everything they had out of their tool basket to put into play. And with that particular press conference, when that narrative started, all the way up to what we're dealing with now.
Thank you, Marsha. One of the things that I know I've been thinking about, and others have as well, is really a little bit more about our diversity in our city in terms of people and audiences that are listening to these messages, as well as the role of social media, the new communication strategies that are available. Alberto, you're really an expert in this. Many people are comparing the protests and the media relations moment to the 60s, or even to back just to the RNC convention in 2008. Can you provide us some insight into maybe how audiences and media have shifted that really makes this a little bit different? And maybe what you can comment on and others can comment on if they'd like to chime in, what opportunities and constraints there are for both reaching diverse audiences as well as maybe having too much media involved in some ways.
Sure. A few ideas what's happening, and I think that there's a number of components right now. I think the obvious change is how quickly communications, since the 60s. In the 60s, you had some mainstream outlets that in very different timing communicated, and that's how everybody found out about what was going on. Now, obviously, the social media complex, the social media component has added a lot of complexity, but I wanted to add a few insights of things that were happening during a lot of the nights and the protests and how people were getting information. First of all, a lot of people who were protesting in the streets with very understandable anger do not really believe anymore on any of the institutions, be it media, being leaders, even some of the own protest leaders were really having a hard time communicating with a lot of young people. There's a lot of young people right now who just really do not believe in institutions and are looking for their own ways to get information. The amount of views that were happening on social media on some of the protest nights were comparable and probably beating national cable companies. Looking at, for example, how a lot of people I know were accessing videos on Snapchat, on TikTok. There is another example. There was a former used to be a Spanish radio station here in the Twin Cities that went under a few years ago. Some of the people that were working on that radio station have set up a Facebook page that has about 20,000 followers. They broadcast online Spanish radio. They were very bravely, and I know a lot of these individuals very well, very bravely were reporting on Facebook Live. I saw 500, close to 400 and some thousand views in one of those videos. They were there when the 3rd precinct was being burned down. And they were transmitting locally in Spanish. Obviously, this grew into a wider national Spanish-speaking audience. So some of the challenges there, people were watching live a lot what was happening faster and in their own language than a lot of the news organizations were transmitting. The challenge there, as I know these folks well, and I have a lot of respect for them, but a lot of information that was coming out as they were filling in time, happened to occasionally not be accurate, right? There hasn't been some of the training in journalism to really look at facts and things like that. So that's an opportunity to keep people informed. But there was a number of incidents that were happening live as the governor and the mayors were announcing that they had things under control. People were seeing live with their own eyes that things were not under control. We had, some of the immigrant-owned businesses on Lake Street where we were watching, the terror of what they were going through and, some of the issues that were happening, again, live. So the complexity and size. And I do think that one of the important things that need to happen with leaders that are handling this type of situation now in communications is there is so much that happens online and in social media, and at the same time, personal relationships with individuals are so important. As you know, we have been able to develop relationships with a lot of the people that were putting communication out there. We were in contact with each other, and I was able to sometimes add perspective to what people were communicating out there. So these are one-on-one, mutually beneficial relationships that you develop with people who are now communicating in larger numbers than a lot of our news organizations are.
This issue of trust has come up with our audiences as well. Sam, do you want to build on this?
On the issue of trust or diversity?
Both issues, the issues of diverse audience, as well as kind of the lack of trust potentially with mainstream or general audience sources, and more likely to trust people they know.
Absolutely. So Alberto was just spot on in so many things. I just had to reiterate, Facebook Live has changed everything. It's hard to trick people when they can be out there and see it themselves. But I do think what has changed it's sad to say it hasn't changed enough. And I think that the media and others, they took a hit by not having enough diversity in their newsrooms, in their decision-making position, their decisions of power and authority. And you know, when you talk about trust, you know, being a PR person, a communications person, I can go through a newsroom and tell you, oh, I want that reporter to cover this. Oh, I want this reporter. This is the reporter I trust because this reporter has some kind of experience, some type of background to maybe come close to telling the story the way it needs to be told. And so I think that is a place where, you know, when you start talking about trust, there needs to be experience, there needs to be belief, but people need to feel that this person's credible and they actually care. And so I think that absolutely aligns with diversifying those newsrooms and you know, and on the other side, diversifying those corporations and those positions of leadership to have more people that you don't have to go figure it out when there's a crisis. You have people in that room that can dig into their experience. And if they don't have the knowledge, they can go get it because they already have relationships with the people in the communities. I think that is something that we can learn from this.
And I just want to echo what Stan was saying, that coming from the perspective of an educational institution, being working with young people in the journalism and strategic communication field, we've got to continue to recruit and attract and educate students from diverse backgrounds. That's our job. And so, Stan, I appreciate what you're saying. And not only do we have to get that diversity in newsrooms, but it would be great to get it amongst public relations professionals as well. And any way that we can work together to keep making this happen, that's so important. And going back to Alicia's initial question of how has social media contributed to this change in what we're seeing here, and I see two things. One is that the ubiquity and reach of social media that Alberto and Stan were talking about, that this is the way that so many young people are getting their news and their information. But at the same time, the desire for young people to take action. And that's the mobilizing power of social media. So young people will get their information this way. And this medium has the power to mobilize, and there's a peer pressure, I think, that goes on when, not to say that's a good pressure or a bad pressure, but I think there just is, to get out there and take to the streets. We saw it in this situation. We've seen it in March for Our Lives, in the Philando Castile murder trial. We saw it in Occupy Wall Street. So the power of social media, both to spread information, but to mobilize.
I'd like to comment on the social media. So the flip side of that is social media allows people to seek the information that they agree with and doesn't necessarily cause them to seek a broad view or multiple points of view. So I would, and I don't have any answers, I just see that happening out there with great concern. Obviously, I think that's why we need journalism schools to help train people. But I think in society, we need to help somehow influence people to say, consider other points of view and don't always just seek your own. That's the flip side of that. It's mobilizing, yes, and it can be mobilized for good, but it can also be mobilized for bad as well, or whatever. So I think it's kind of two things we have to keep our eye on. And I really don't have the answer for the other one. It's human nature to validate ourselves and our own opinions. And it's up to all of us to help people see, even our clients, to see multiple points of view and to instill that kind of thinking throughout society to some degree. That's a big thought, but you know, that's something that I look at and go, yeah, you know, we have to be open-minded.
I think that there are a couple of things going on. I'm referring to Alberto's point with the broadcast utilizing the social media platform when the precinct was burning. I'm thinking about some of the smaller media outlets, community media outlets, who are utilizing social media platforms to reach audiences because they don't necessarily have the resources, the financial resources. And if we as PR professionals, going back to the point, Stan's point of being prepared, and that means developing relationships. I'm thinking of Insight News. In recent weeks, they really, really amped up their social media presence, and they've been doing daily video podcasts starting during the COVID-19 period, and they had to move from their offices and working remotely. And so they leverage that, and they're tapping into experts of color, you know, physicians, medical professionals, social workers, psychologists. And so they are going to where they know younger audiences are, and where younger audiences are and where they get their news source from is on social media platforms. And so I think they're helping Tom to move the needle and move out the echo chamber. They're elbowing into the space of, all right, social media, we're going to help to change the paradigm and help it not be such an echo chamber where people are going only to get one point of view. And it's really important. I'm going to go back to Stan's point from when he walked into a newsroom, or when we walk into organizations, companies. Are there people who are people going to see folks who look like themselves? So is someone going to see another person who looks like me, who is a PR professional, or who is a journalist? That's where part of the trust comes in. Today's title of this panel is Ethical Public Relations. Well, part of ethical public relations, in my view, is having diversity, equity, inclusion, helping to build up the trust. And to Stacey, to your point about educating young folks and the new crop of PR professionals who are going to be coming through your classrooms and learning the skills and going out into the future. One of the things that I am just really so proud as a diversity and inclusion officer from Minnesota PRSA, we are today actually announcing that we are the inaugural donor of the National PRSA, in collaboration with National PRSA, of the Multicultural Student Scholarship, the Endowed Multicultural Student Scholarship. There's always been a multicultural student scholarship program, not widely known, struggled in the past, but with it becoming endowed and Minnesota PRSA being the inaugural donor for that, this will help to ensure that students coming through the doorways of institutions here in Minnesota and other schools across the country, multicultural students, that they will be able to complete their education and gain the skills and go out and make a difference in our agencies and in our organizations and companies.
Thank you, Marsha, and thank you for announcing that news, because that is so important, having more support and, so to speak, the cheese in place to encourage people to go into a field where they're not always going to be rewarded. They're not always going to see faculty and others who look like them. We all have so much more work to do, but getting the resources there to make it a little easier for students to move into these fields is also so important, and our schools support that too. I want to make sure to talk a little bit about the influence of students and young people in the protesters at the University of Minnesota, also in Minneapolis public schools, led by at Minnesota. It was our student government leader who appealed to our president to ask that the university and its contractual relationships and security relationships with the Minneapolis Police Department. I suspect we're going to see many protests and calls for other local agencies, the park board recently, to disengage as well. And so I wanted to go to Stan, who's had some experience in schools, to ask, as a communication officer, how do you ethically manage this situation and communicate new plans and policies with your publics? And also, how do you let people down sometime?
Yeah. I want to start by saying, like, when I first started in schools, I remember student protest, and I remember the superintendent and everybody else was saying, well, we have to protect instructional time. And that was our nice way of shutting down a student protest. And so that was years ago. When I first arrived in Minneapolis Public Schools, we hadn't embraced them, but by the time I left Minneapolis Public Schools, I was on TV saying things like, this is a teachable moment. I mean, we're so proud of our students for stepping up and delivering a message. And so I go back to the culture and the values of an organization. You know, as they change, as they evolve, the communication team or person needs to be there with them. And so you have your plans, you write your communication plans. We all know how to do that. Is it lacking some things? Does it need to include the student voice? And not just, you know, your messages that you're going to tell what the students to say. Have you engaged the students so you can partner with the students on that voice, on that message, as well as the community? So it's, you know, the way I look at it, and you write a communication plan, you do all the work, and then you hope that when you try to see if it's going to cover everybody, when you do the real work to find out, is it covering all the groups? Your communication plan most of the time needs to change, and you need to add those components to it, the student's voice. That's just my perspective on this one.
Thank you. I think all of us have some expertise in working with young people, as well as in teaching students or training others. And so, Amy, from a practical perspective, when you're training students, how do you train them to engage in crisis communication? I see we've had one question. It's not just really crisis communication, it's also ethics, it's media literacy. So answer this as broadly as you'd like.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about the panel and everything that's happened in the last week, and then also thinking about COVID and how some things have changed. And one of the things we work on with students is planning and then practicing your crisis communication plan. And so this semester we did a large simulation with students around a fictional crisis. But one of the things that we talked about was all of the work that you do prior to the crisis is very important. And so when we think about inclusion in who's in the conversation in terms of planning, this isn't an add-on where all of a sudden now you have a crisis in a particular group of publics, and so you start adding people in. That has to be part of who you are and your culture. And so when you think about planning, it's not something that comes from a different place. And I think this idea of multivocality in your crisis plan that matches your publics is really important. And that becoming authentic to who you are as an organization. So we talk a lot about thinking about the organization that you're in, and as the comms person having a seat at that decision-making table, so that you can help the leaders think about things more broadly than perhaps just an economic. Most of my research is with Fortune 500 companies, so I tend to look at it a little differently than with the government organizations in this crisis in particular, but really trying to understand a broad base and doing your research and doing it well. So you're making decisions based off of really the best information that you can at the time.
Stacey, when you also teach strategy and organizational strategy, and I know that some of your students have been asking recently, and you've been kind of thinking about how should organizations respond to protesters, you know, and not just organizations, but others on this panel might want to also comment How do you counsel protesters related to managing their identity as well, which is very important? Stacey,
Yep. So the first thing that we do when we're talking about how to respond to protesters or how to engage in an activism movement is to make sure that we all understand the purposes of activism in our society and the fundamental constitutional right that citizens have to become civically and politically active. So that as our building block to then build in what the things that our panel have been talking about, which is building relationships between organizations and publics, and having that be the goal in mind rather than responding in any kind of an adversarial stance. And so ideally, we want to understand why the protests are taking place and to be able to address those issues rather than just responding to a protest, but to understand that, that people are expressing their need to be heard, that they are exercising their constitutional right to assembly and to speech, and that the press is exercising its right to cover these issues. So as communications professionals, we need to really understand this clearly, but at the same time, be aware of the legal issues, not trespassing on private property, doing protests or activist movements in a peaceful manner. And so then the ideal becomes to promote and build dialogue. Also, it's important to know that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And as Amy was saying, planning is key. So that ahead of time, we want to be able to identify our messages, our spokespeople, who are in our audiences, and what channels are the right communication channels to use. Now, things don't always go as planned. We want to avoid back and forth arguments. We want to not necessarily respond to threats or bullying tactics, because we want to understand that oftentimes these are done to attract and gain media attention, but not to advance a solution. And so if we're thinking of long-term relationships and reputation building, not only of our organization, but the community, we want to really think in terms of the long-term relationships. In addition, we talk about the value of face-to-face discussion, and several on our panel have talked about this, the building of relationships, not necessarily just communicating through the press or through social media, but the value of sincerity, the value of understanding when to apologize, how to apologize with authenticity, and when it's time for remedial action. We talk about that protesting can come in many forms for organizations. We've seen it with labor unions, ranging from teachers to nurses to pilots to airline mechanics. And how do we as communication professionals become involved and respond to those issues? Students protest, customers of Chick-fil-A protest. And students, I found, are very interested in these sort of ways to become active and to become involved in these issues. Counsel that we talk about giving people who want to become activists themselves. In fact, one of our students in the Strategic Communication Master's program this summer is doing her capstone project on how to keep a protest movement alive on social media. She started this several months ago, and she's looking at the Citizen Amendment Act in India as her case study. But here are some of the things that we found. One is to encourage authenticity among participants of that protest movement. Be careful of those who want to join for self-serving reasons. Two is to understand the issue that that movement is facing from all sides so that you can speak credibly. And we talk about the essence of credibility, the expertise, the trust, and the goodwill that we need to build. We've advised people not to post stuff on social media unless they check and double check the facts, because it's not good to have to walk things back. And to use the tools of good media relations strategy, so develop relationships with reporters and editors in advance, to clear up rumors and misinformation with facts, to do so quickly, to speak truthfully, and with genuine emotion. And going back to what Amy said, it all begins with that plan. So plan in advance, even though the plan may not be perfect and we're gonna need to go back and monitor it and change it in real time. Whenever we are representing an organization, whether it's an activist group or a corporation or a branch of government, we kind of get a feel for what crises could come down our way and put something together so we're not starting from scratch when it happens.
Thank you so much, Stacey. I want to make sure that we have some time. I see that it's about 1 o'clock to take questions from our audience members. I see one now that I'd like to ask the panel to think about, and the question's from an anonymous attendee. They thanked the panelists for this invaluable discussion and asked, how do we as mid-level communications professionals address a supervisor who views organizational commentary on this issue as too activist of a message for our stakeholders? And I got a message that was very similar to this before this panel. That was someone from within the university asking, do you have any advice when you're, of what to do in a situation like this with our communication? And we don't want to share too much good news. I don't know if we can make a statement, et cetera. So, what is the right recipe for organizational commentary and how do you act? Amy, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the things that this brings to mind is I've been thinking about the difference in my email from corporations responding to COVID and having messages to me about what they were doing about COVID and health, and the relatively near silence in my email and friends who I've asked about the murder of George Floyd from large corporations in particular. And some of them are doing some things on their websites, but not as much. And that led me to a recent article in the New York Times that said more corporate voices, typically shy on issues, speak out on racism. And this was an interesting article because oftentimes corporations especially try to separate their brand from anything controversial. They're trying to protect it from any association. And so I've seen this in the corporate social responsibility. The social issues that they'll get involved in are typically ones that aren't particularly controversial. And so children's health is one of the largest social issues that corporations like to support because everyone tends to agree about children's health. And it's the reason we see corporate support around the issue of breast cancer compared to lung cancer or other forms of cancer. And so I think one of the challenges is to sort of have that conversation about who are we as an organization, what are our values, what do we believe in, and what type of communities are we engaged in, both in terms of consumers and where our operations are. And one of the things that struck me at the end of this article, they interviewed an influencer who has more than 3 million subscribers on YouTube, and she had been trying to encourage Fashion Nova to engage this issue. And at the end, she says, if you are capitalizing off a culture, you're morally obligated to help them. And I thought that that was an interesting way to think about social issues and how as organizations we interact with social issues or different communities, and then what obligations we have when we're profiting off of that, that relationship when the community then needs some assistance or help, and how corporations or organizations can sort of have that space where they can demonstrate their responsibility and the relationships they have over time.
Stan?
I used to have this a lot in a huge organization like Minneapolis Public Schools, and you have just a lot of smart people, and it's hard to get to the decision makers sometimes. And so I think some advice is make sure that when you do have an opportunity to present, that you have really good information, good data, and make your argument not just on passion, but also on the information. But I also think that, you know, a lot of times we overestimate the importance of talking to that one supervisor. You know, you need to find allies in different departments in different areas, and there's going to be somebody that probably aligns with you. And so now all of a sudden you have a dynamic where you've communicated to a supervisor a message, but they're also hearing it from someone else, sometimes a colleague, somebody maybe even higher up than them. And all of a sudden that they won't admit it at the time, but you just had a great idea, and they're not going to forget that either. And so I think, you know, be determined. Like if one person says no, continue to find allies around you that can help you. And that has been really effective in some places where I've been, because it's really hard to get to the top. But you know what? People will notice it. They will notice you when you do that, especially if you do it in the right way, and they won't forget it. And what they consider radical now, in a year or two, they'll be giving you credit. Like, I'm glad you thought of that. And so be encouraged, keep doing it.
First of all, I don't want to put Stan on the spot, but I did have the privilege of working with him. I was chair of the Minneapolis School Board when he was our chief communications officer. And I have to say that he's an example of what a communications officer should be like, as far as transparency, honesty, bravery, and presenting the facts the way they are, and presenting to his leaders in the right way. I just didn't want to put you in the spot, but I just wanted to say that. One of the things we've been involved with, our NewPublica has been involved with all week, we've been writing a lot of statements, mainly to nonprofits and foundations. And most of them have been white-led, some of them have been POC-led, but not Black-led. And just a few things that I kind of wanted to bring into this. First of all, if you're going to put a statement, make sure that somebody who's Black has looked at the statement and has contributed to the statement. This is nobody else, I can guarantee you, nobody else understands what it feels like right now other than the Black person, or somebody who's got to constantly worry about relatives who might come home or not, or themselves, right? So I think that's something very important. This is a moment where somebody in the Black community has been murdered after many, many years of this happening. And that has to, I think that has to be a lens that has to somehow be brought into the conversation. The other thing is, it's a time to be bold, and I have been incredibly pleasantly surprised about how willing the people we've been working with are willing to say things that they would have never said before. And to be very specific about steps that you are taking right now. That is not just words, but this is specifically things that we're currently working with. I think Stan is absolutely correct that years from now, you will get credit for something that might be perceived risky now. But I am not seeing, I am actually, as we're being cautious sometimes with our communications, I'm actually seeing a lot of people we're working actually wanting to be more bold. I also wanted to just comment something. I don't have a lot of advice to give to the protesters. I think they've been doing a phenomenal job right now. We are already seeing, not just locally and nationally, the results. We've seen movement that we've never seen before. I think they've been incredibly effective and disciplined in their communications and in their actions. There are other issues that are complicating things out there, and that this is not the time really probably to be giving Black leaders advice also on how to approach protests. I think this is a time for us to be supportive and take direction from leaders, Black leaders or leaders of color, and seeing how we can be supportive without doing the tendency that a lot of people have to give advice or tell you how this should be done. So just a few more comments I wanted to add there. Thanks.
So I wanted to weigh in on Stan too. I had the opportunity to work with him a little bit, and so I echo all the positive comments that Alberto said as well. So Stan, you're a great guy, and I am glad I know you. I just wanted to, as a person who, my phone started ringing with a lot of corporations wanting to make statements. And, it certainly has evolved over just a week, but, and I've collected so many letters now and analyzed them, but when this started, the first question out of my mouth to all of them is, why do you want to do this? And where are you coming from? And, you can imagine the gamut ran from, I think, corporations that are enlightened and pursuing diversity, equity, and inclusion, that came from a very sincere place, all the way to people feeling like they had to do this because everybody else was. And I love the comment that if they're white driven alone, they're probably missing the mark. I think also my counsel to a lot of these organizations was, don't overreach yourself. Where are you right now? And where can you go? And where can you articulate a step that you're going to take? The challenge is, in some of these organizations, they have not commented on social issues before. And how do you go from 0 to 100 in one letter? And you have to also take into account, where are your employees at? And how do you become part of the conversation without getting ahead of yourself, without saying something that you can't be held accountable for in the future? The other challenge I've seen in some organizations is they've not thought too deeply about this, or they may have differing points of view. I worked with one organization where, the issue was, how do we comment on our relationship with the police? And it was a very difficult conversation because people were coming down on all sides of the issue. So it's been a lot of work. At the end of the day, it's like I'm exhausted because there's so much to take in so quickly. But I know an important aspect of getting there is listening to yourself, listening to your employees, listening to other voices, and making sure that whatever you say, that it's really something that comes from within and that has some accountability to it. So I think I'm echoing a little bit what Alberto said, but it's been a challenge. And but I have to say, I've been really amazed at how this issue has really, people have been brave, and that's a really good thing.
I too have been called a lot this week and have reviewed statements and provided guidance in terms of how to approach this. And I echo what others have said. And back to this original question of how at a mid-level manager position can one be able to lend their voice and guidance when they feel as though they may not be listened to. And another approach is taking a look at the organization or the company's mission statements, their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. What do the statements say? And in conversations beyond with one supervisor or their manager, go to some of those allies within the organization and use the very verbiage, if you may, that has been created. And it can be positioned as a way to really activate or put into motion the words, some action behind the words that may be on the website, that's in annual reports regarding diversity, equity, inclusion, racism, and use that as a nudge in terms of helping to craft a statement, social media posts, and communications to internal and external.
Thank you, Marsha. I want to take another question from audience members, and I want to make sure to remind people that you're welcome to send us a couple questions through the question and answer box. Dave Thurkelson asks, Liz Collin, conflict of interest or not, has WCCO handled the situation properly? And the situation, of course, is that the police union, I don't know if it's word is chief or chair or president, but Bob Kroll, I believe is his name, is married to Liz Collin, who has worked for WCCO. And so there have been protests directed both at the police union, but also at WCCO. From kind of a, this is just another crisis within a crisis, really. Who'd like to comment on that?
Well, I will. Thanks, Dave, for that very difficult question. So I saw the hashtag pop up, and that's how I became aware of, I think, whatever day there was a 4 o'clock protest. I think the hashtag was Fire Liz Collins. I don't really follow, I didn't follow it enough to say anything intelligent about the ramifications, but to my knowledge, Liz hasn't been reporting. Is that correct? I'm not sure. Does anybody know? So I was a little not sure how to react to that. I mean, I felt like maybe that was an overreach on behalf of the protesters, but you know, it's hard to tell, and I haven't been able to follow it close enough. But I did see it. And it's kind of a general tenor of that mistrust of the media kind of playing out in different ways. So I think that's yet to be resolved. So those are my comments. Stan,
I'll let you comment, but my impression as a relatively newcomer to Minneapolis, most of you know I've only lived here for about 3 years, is that she has not reported on the police department for the past 2.5 years. And that was after this conflict of interest was pointed out about 2.5 years ago by protesters over another issue. So that, I think, sets the scene for the current situation. However, I think that protesters will protest whatever will work to get their work done. So Stan, do you want to comment on?
Yeah, this will be different, but I want to thank Alberto and Tom for those kind remarks. Man, when I was at Minneapolis Public Schools, it didn't feel like it though. You know, you're just doing what you can do. But this issue right here, I mean, I can do a simple answer. I do think that WCCO is doing the best they can with that issue. I get it, but the lesson here is, when you are like in a position like the police department is, you never know who's actually kind of coming after you behind the scenes. And so I'm a part of a startup group called Vitals Aware Services. We've created the Vitals app, and our president and CEO is Janae Harto. She's a former police chief of Minneapolis. And you know, it's been kind of fun being able to push out messages to try to make sure that we get rid of a cancer in the police department. Is that a strong enough statement? And I think that Janae has been quiet since she's left the Minneapolis, the city of Minneapolis, and this is her moment to kind of talk about, you know, she had a lot of reforms in place that she was trying to get done, and you know, one of the main issues was that particular union and that particular person. And so I know this might not tie into communications, but I'm going to try as hard. And you know, you can work hard at developing messages, but you don't necessarily always know where it's coming from. All of a sudden you see messages from Janae, all of a sudden you see messages from RT Ryback. And so some of this stuff is not coincidence, and it's planned, and you got to be ready for all things. But that's my message on that one.
Alberto?
Yeah, I just wanted to, you know, as far as I know, WCCO, yeah, she has not been reporting, so I don't think there's a clear conflict of interest there. But I think there's a couple other issues that come, you know, into mind here. And to bring some perspective also, one of the things we got to think about media organizations right now is they're incredibly under-resourced right now. So I want to start by, not only revenue had gone down dramatically before COVID, a lot of media organizations right now have lost 50% of the revenue. That includes mainstream and ethnic media. So the how they've been covering, I've heard some comments from national media reporters kind of a little bit surprised at some of the local coverage or lack of local coverage. And they have to understand that they have millions of dollars in resources, and some of the local are really challenged right now with resources. Two is, I think an important issue was brought up in that protest, and it's the lens that a lot of reporting is having. There is a lot of white privilege in a lot of the comments that people are making. And I think it's what's very insightful for me is talking personally with reporters of color that work at mainstream media organizations, and then talking, hearing from white reporters. And there's a very different perspective on a lot of the language and the lens that comes out there. So I think this is a very good opportunity for news organizations to really look at and do some training on history and why some things are perceived by people of color some way that they might not be. That simply saying, well, I'm just presenting the facts, which they are, very often, and they're very true in how they feel about that, but how a lot of the language they use will be perceived by intended audiences. So there are ways to say the same thing differently, present the facts, but say them differently. So.
Elisia? Yeah, I think going back to Bob Kroll, there is no doubt that he has been a polarizing figure in our community for several years. He's a public figure. Liz Collins is a bit of a celebrity. She is a public figure. The public, the people, many folks have had enough. I mean, you can read this on the editorial pages of the Star Tribune. It's no secret. And folks are, like you said, looking for opportunities to speak out on this. And by making the connection between Bob Kroll and his spouse, that is a legitimate concern. Whether or not she's actively covering the Minneapolis Police Department or police issues in general is another topic, but I think that it's a legitimate concern, and it should be raised, and that the public has the right to speak up and speak out about this. These are good conversations to have. Let's see what the Kroll family has to say about it. But yeah, let's have that discussion.
Elisia, I'd like to add too that as I saw this start to come up, I think back to an article that was done, I believe, about a year ago, maybe a little bit more, about the fact that the two of them were married. And when I think of our role as communicators, and when it goes back to the point that has been made throughout today's conversation, and that is being prepared. And with going back to what transpired on Memorial Day, I don't want to chastise, but I just think as communicators that ensuring that we're prepared and anticipating that this may come up. And then thinking about, once again, communicating to the public and sitting in the public's chair in receiving the messaging, the perception. All of us, every single day in our jobs, we counsel people on being prepared, how to communicate, and having messaging ready to go. And we counsel on reputation management and brand and public perception. Huge perception in this situation.
Thank you, Marsha. We are running out of, we have about 5 more minutes left. I have a brief poll that I'd like for our remaining attendees to take. But before that, I want to give each of our panelists a few seconds to provide any concluding thoughts, because I deeply appreciate each of their willingness to be here today and to be recorded so that others may see this in the future. I think we've covered a lot of really important topics on PR ethics and press conferences and responsibility. So I thank you all. Stacey, do you want to start? Do you have any?
Yes, it's just been a pleasure today to talk with all of our panelists and to reach out to our community. And again, I would like to encourage everyone to help us bring people of color, African Americans into our journalism school, into our program, into our strategic communication master's program. Please come, let us partner with you on this.
Thank you, Stacey. And we have an information session on June 10th, I believe that's Monday, at noon for anyone who is interested in that professional master's program. Alberto, any last words?
Sure, I want to echo what Stacey was saying, absolutely. I mean, I want to see a lot more people of color go into the education field. And by the way, once they graduate, please hire them, because I have talked to a number of communications people of color that have been struggling a little bit with that. But I think this is an incredible moment. I thank the university and the PRSA to address this very important issue, and a very good opportunity for us to learn and to start looking at how we do things differently in the future. Thanks.
And Stan, last words from you.
Thank you for having me. I think the only thing I'm thinking about is when the media coverage starts dying down, when the protest starts dying down, you know, I am hopeful that people on here will continue to do the work, because it's not when all the time, it's when it's a lot of noise. It's when you can actually have a calm and start really working on the work, and that's what I'm hopeful for.
Thank you. Marsha?
Thank you, Elisia, University of Minnesota Hubbard School, for hosting this, and Minnesota PRSA. I'm going to make a small pitch for Minnesota PRSA, and that is, and as diversity inclusion officer, we decided to no longer have one-offs when it came to our diversity and inclusion efforts. And we wanted to have it be baked into the fabric of the organization. And I would encourage folks to get involved. I am also fortunate to kind of have my feet in both worlds as a member of Twin Cities Black Journalists and the National Association of Black Journalists Media Related Task Force. So I still get both worlds, and the work continues. There's a lot of work ahead. I echo what Stan said about when things quiet down, we must continue forging ahead. And hopefully there will not be a repeat, that we do not have to traverse this road again.
Thank you, Marsha. And Amy?
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to be part of the panel today, and especially Minnesota PRSA's co-sponsorship of this. That's just wonderful. I think when I think about the crisis that people are dealing with now, it highlights to me that most crises have warning signs, and to recognize in our organizations even those things that make us uncomfortable to see, because that can help us plan, and to Marsha's point, take the learning when everything has calmed down and think about broader organizational structures. What are our values, and do our words and our deeds match those professed mission statements and values? And I think that can really help not only with how our organization operates, but the way we communicate with publics beyond consumers.
Thank you. And Tom?
Well, thank you everybody for including me on this panel, and for for hosting it. I'm just going to step back a little bit, and Amy, you mentioned your work in corporate social responsibility. I think the occurrence of these two events, COVID, a worldwide pandemic that we've never seen before, and the murder of George Floyd, together have altered the corporate landscape in a way that we're just beginning to see. And I think this concept of investing in social capital was kind of moving forward, but I think that this is going to really accelerate that discussion in our corporations. And it's key that we act as guides, helping corporations make steps that allow them to invest in invest their capital in social capital things that not only advance their business or their organization, but advance a democratic society. And I know that's a big word, and I don't know quite what that means until I get down to each individual organization. But I see a new world there, and it's going to be much more vibrant than it ever has been before. And I'm excited to see it and help it bring it forward.
Thank you all. Before we leave, I'd like to ask audience a couple poll questions. First, we're very interested in seeing if you'd be interested in receiving email about upcoming events. So please feel free to respond briefly to this poll. And keep it open for a couple more seconds so people can find their polling button and interact. I appreciate those of you who have done so. And then the second question is just simply, I wanted to see if you could give us some feedback on this event. I hope that you found it helpful and responsive to the topic. I'm very grateful for our professionals, and if you could give us some feedback on how well we did today in staying true to our topic. I appreciate all of your feedback. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope that you'll consider joining us for our events next week. We do have a number of wonderful panels on photojournalism, on ethics of covering protests from the streets, as well as covering communities from people who live and reside and work within these communities. On behalf of the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication, I want to thank our panelists. We are deeply grateful for being with us today, for partnering with our school, not just in this moment, but always, and I really appreciate that. Also the College of Liberal Arts that supported and promoted this event as well. Thank you all, and I hope that you have a wonderful afternoon.